My name is Rachel. I'm a mother of 3 amazing children. I'm a single parent. I'm a professional. I have 2 jobs. I'm a lecturer at one of the universities in London. I'm a speech and language therapist working for the NHS with deaf people. I'm also a sister, a woman, and I'm a survivor. And I'm here today to talk about my journey of survival and being a survivor. And that's the word I like to use for people who've experienced significant and severe abuse. And the other word I like to use is warrior. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to describe survivors of abuse as warriors, because we are war victims. We have survived warfare. So to have done that, we have to be brave, we have to be strong, we have to be courageous, we have to have tenacity. There's so many things that will be in us, and we will have grown in strange ways to have become that warrior, as well as the suffering that we will have experienced. My experience was I fled my own house in July 2020, just as the first COVID lockdown was easing and some movement was allowed again. I fled my own house in the middle of the night on a Saturday night, and I left with 2 bags. And it was my own house. I'd paid for it, every penny, and I owned it outright. And everything in that house I owned outright. And I left the entire lot behind in exchange for my freedom. And the reason I'm beginning with that moment of leaving is because for me, it was an unusual moment of clarity and calmness that lasted probably about 2 hours before absolute terror descended again. But for me, it's always stayed with me, that clarity and calmness that took over me, and the absolute certainty that I had in that moment about what I'd done. And I think people who haven't experienced having to leave don't really understand what it has taken and what it takes to leave successfully. I think there are still a lot of misunderstandings about how difficult it is. It's way, 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 way more difficult than anybody could imagine. And there are way more barriers in our society than people can imagine.
So this first poem that I'm going to read is a poem that summarises me, I guess, and my journey. It's called Warrior Lioness. She carried her glorious golden lit mane and looked to the sun. Treading forward slowly, she has to leave, but is afraid to run. She carried on her back each step, her family, her pride. Her eyes were face forward, knowing the wind carried a cruel tide. Her strong limbs pacing, determined to move her pride far away, where no more blood would be shed, no more foul, deadly play. She paced on through the night and through many more exhausting a day, until an old one with wisdom granted her pride protection, a safe way. Her mane of glory still sits atop of her brow as she looks to the horizon, thinking, where to now? The path that she took is a fight seldom won. She did it alone with her instincts. No tribe, just warrior one. Would you know her if you met her? This warrior with a lion inside? She'll be sitting among you. Her mane still atop of her pride.
I experienced over 20 years of living in a coercive, controlling relationship with my ex-partner, who, like all coercive, controlling individuals, terrorised and abused myself and his children. There is no circumstance in which a person who's coercive, controlling person is not going to perpetrate their abuse towards everybody in that household. That's just a myth. That just doesn't happen. So what happened to me happened to all of us, and I like to describe it as a buy one, get one free, only you buy one, get 4 free. If you abuse one person in that household, you terrorise everybody anyway. There is no detachment anybody can make if they're living in that house between their experience and what is happening around them. If it's happening in their environment, if it's happening to somebody they love, then it's happening to them. Since I left, I've done a lot more research into abuse and the signs of abuse and the signs of coercive control, and to understand my own experience and to understand what has happened to me. But what I would say is that before I left, despite my huge amount of education and a huge amount of professional knowledge, even I didn't know what coercive control was. And I'm a very well-educated woman, and I hadn't heard of it until I reached out for help and got told what it was. So we've got a lot to do to help people understand what coercive control is, and despite having an amazingly good law in this country, and I'm not a big fan of Theresa May, believe me, I'm not, but one thing I will say about Theresa May is her record on trying to change the laws around domestic abuse are second to none. That woman is to be admired for what she did in this country to bring about that law. So we have a very good law. It's based on extensive research from America to make a very robust law, but hardly anybody knows about it, and the police definitely don't know the law because, and I'm not surprised because I haven't been trained in it. There has been no training to the police force on what coercive control is or that law. So it's not surprising that it's not really very well understood. The other thing I would say about abuse is that it's always changing and evolving, and the way that it happens to people changes and evolves as our society changes and evolves. And so the experiences that are written down on those websites and might be signs of domestic abuse weren't matching well, because I did sometimes look up those things, or was suggested that I should by some people around me, and they just didn't have the right examples on there. So I didn't feel that's what I was experiencing. I thought I was experiencing someone who had mental health problems. Severe mental health problems is what I thought I was experiencing. I knew there were problems, but I thought they were due to severe mental health. And then once I did know that what I was living with was abuse, trying to end a relationship and leave safely is something that you can only do by trying and learning what doesn't work, because the advice that you get, even if you reach out, is minimal. There is minimal practical advice. There's minimal practical, well, this is what we know is more successful, this is what your options are, these are the things you can do. And what you get when you reach out to the domestic abuse services is them tiptoeing around saying, well, I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a legal advisor. And then you get the legal team saying, well, I don't know about abuse, I'm just a legal advisor, I'm not an expert in domestic abuse. So between those two people not giving you all of your answers, you're left to work it out for yourself. And that is what happens to every woman. And then you couple that with the social services and the police still having a bias towards severe physical injury, and a total misunderstanding what coercive control of domestic abuse is. And you know that. You already know that as a woman. You already know that the whole of society doesn't believe women. You know that the whole of society doesn't believe women if they say they've been raped, and most rape victims don't come forward. We all know this, women know it. We know that our experiences are minimised. We know that we're told we have to provide. As a woman, you know that you can't have complete faith and trust in telling your truth completely. The other thing I know from my experience is that you are literally expected to come with a dossier of evidence in your hands. No one will investigate anything at all, despite what you will report. You're expected to literally have it on you. You're expected to have collected all of this evidence, and what they'll say is that there's no crime because there's no evidence and there's not enough evidence. And what they will do is that no one will investigate it at all. They will investigate nothing. They will collect no evidence whatsoever unless you are physically injured or you're carrying it with you. It's an appalling expectation to have of victims, but nevertheless, it is this country's expectation. I'm not going to dwell too much on the experts in this field, but I have done a lot of reading myself because I like to understand things from, from the perspective of the theory behind it. There are two experts that I drew upon the most when I left. One is Professor Evan Stark, who's the world's leading expert in domestic abuse, and the man, in my opinion, is a legend. And if you haven't heard of him, look him up and watch his YouTube videos. He is the one that has campaigned for the most change around domestic abuse across the world. And he is the one who has done the most research. And what he says is that until we understand this as being a crime, until we treat it as a crime, and until we see it as a crime of hostage taking and holding people captive, nothing is going to change. And he says all too often what happens is that everyone expects the situation to wait until the person who's held hostage has got a tiny hole left from which to escape from. And basically, that's way too late.
So this poem is about the moment of leaving. It's called This Is the Moment. This is the moment. I stood shaking by my open front door, terrified but hoping to make it, knowing I deserved more. This is the moment. I know if I stay here tonight, I will die, using everything I've learned and know, believing I can get out if I try. This is the moment I got in the car and turned that key, put my foot on the gas and drove myself up the hill and free. This is the moment I knew for sure I was never going back, never again returning to my own house, an end to a 3-day endless attack. This is the moment when for 5 minutes, everything was clear, so completely certain and calm, eyes face forward without a single tear. This is the moment on a night after lockdown in July, when I changed my path forever, leaving behind all answers as to why.
I didn't have the classic experience of a person experiencing the coercive control, but some of the main experiences that a perpetrator of coercive control will utilise in their reign of control over you were there, but they were much more masterfully played out. So what you read about is this love bombing period and the first period of the relationship. There was no love bombing, okay? So my perpetrator became my friend. He didn't love bomb me. He became a really close friend. He became a person who revealed a lot of his story, who told me a lot about himself. He was very attentive, he was a lot of fun, he was good to chat to, and he got me to talk about myself a lot. And he paid me a lot of attention, and he was a very reliable person. He was quirky, he was unusual, he was a little bit difficult to be around at times. So I knew he had mental health problems, and I knew his story would lead to mental health problems. So when he found it difficult in social situations or difficult amongst social groups or amongst my friends or some of my friends, I didn't consider that to be deliberately trying to isolate me. And it was a slow burn with my perpetrator. He didn't isolate me from everybody in the same way. He used different tactics to slowly isolate me, is what I would say. He didn't use the classic jealousy card. He just used the, I feel uncomfortable, they're not my cup of tea. If you want to go out with those people, you're more than welcome, but I'm not comfortable to come. He did the, every friend, every close relative you'll have, they'll have flaws, won't they? And no one's perfect. He would amplify their flaws, he would amplify their mistakes, and then he would point out to you why perhaps that person wasn't a good friend, or not a good sister, or not a good mother, or perhaps they weren't treating you well at the moment, and why do you want to go and see them when they've just let you down about this, or they just criticised you about that, or they were late for this, or they, you know, weren't there for you in this particular moment in time. And that's what he did. He amplified people's mistakes to isolate me. So what he did was he made himself my soulmate slowly. There was no love bombing. He listened intently to my story. He listened intently to my likes and dislikes, and he gradually moulded himself into that person. Until we'd formed a romantic relationship, and a strong one, and he was very loyal. He was kind. He did multiple acts of kindness in the early stages of our relationship. So a lot of the warning signs, the early warning signs and flags, were not there. It wasn't a fast relationship, really. It took several years for him to persuade me to move in with him, and several years later on we had children. The mood started to show. He would disappear frequently. He would all the time be using these tactics to sort of criticise me, criticise my appearance, criticise my behaviours, give me the silent treatment if he didn't like something. And I suppose those were the only sort of early warning signs of something being wrong. In his story, he did have 2 relationships ending suddenly, which he had explanations for, but now I look back, both of them did exactly the same as me. They left suddenly in the middle of the night. But he had his explanations, and he seemed so kind. And this wasn't a sudden relationship.
This poem is about the abuse itself. It's called Seeing Inside the Dark. Every day I had no space, hiding every surface of my real face. Very little room for there to be. A tiny corner to the left was me. Inside I was frozen scared, treading tiptoes up the stairs, shouting, throwing, pushing me, watching recordings so I'm never free. Choosing what it is I wear, never seeing who was really there, telling me the words to say, complaining I do wrong anyway. Repeated jokes that are not funny, pet names but I'm not your honey, nothing ever good enough, holding me down, playing rough. Talking for hours so I can't sleep, secretly in the dark I silently weep. Deliberate neglect when I was sick. In the cupboard you keep 4 whips. Telling me you'll strangle and take my last breath, not knowing I'm not afraid of death, boasting there's not a mark to see, and how you stole so much from me. This and more is my dark tale, no war story to regale, but the walking wounded nevertheless am I, as I walk onwards looking to the sky.
Over the years, what happened was every type of abuse that you can imagine happened to me. So there was a lot of emotional abuse, which ranged from personal attacks of my character, undermining and criticising me, having constant jokes that weren't funny about who I was or what I was, criticising my appearance, criticising my clothes, severe neglect or abuse of me when I was ill or my children were ill, just withdrawing a lot from supporting me emotionally whenever I was experiencing a difficult time, particularly when my mother died. He used to do what I would call psychological torture tactics. So what he would do if he was very angry with some transgression in his mind was he would then interrogate you about all your transgressions, and he would bring evidence into his interrogation of you as to why these transgressions were true about you. And he would interrogate you for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. He had cameras in every room of the house. He had recording devices on absolutely everything. He had spyware. He had gone to India. He had gone to various places and got extremely sophisticated technical equipment to get into absolutely everything I did on any electronic device, no matter where I was. He had cameras in the car. He had cameras in the garden. He had cameras over the front door. He recorded my every movement at every hour of the day, and all of the movements and all of the actions of my children. And then what he would do is use those recordings to interrogate you. He was physically very aggressive, but did not injure you. So he would push you, he would shove you, he would stand over you, he would push you down, he would hold you down, he would shout really loudly right in your face. He would throw things, he would break things, he would wave knives around. He did extremely threatening, aggressive things. And I didn't think I'd been physically abused because I had never been punched, I'd never been strangled. But I read afterwards that all of those things are in fact physical abuse. And he did all of those things to all of my children. To my son, he did way worse. He did hit my son. He threw my son down the stairs. He attempted to strangle my son. He hit my son with objects when I was out of the house and I didn't know that it had happened. I found out about that after I'd left, when my son finally told me. He would be cruel to animals. The other form of abuse I experienced, which I didn't realise that I'd experienced, was actually sexual abuse. But it wasn't sexual abuse in the classic understanding of sexual abuse. We're overpowered and where you've been clearly raped because someone has, you know, not listened to you and they've overpowered you and they forced you to do a sexual act with them. His was way, 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 way more psychologically damaging. And I didn't realise that I'd been sexually abused until I watched the movie 50 Shades of Grey, which is a story of coercive sexual abuse. And if anybody thinks it's anything other than that, then they're deluded. It's very well acted, by the way, by Jamie Dornan, who's very, 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 very similar to my perpetrator. Very, very, very similar. Except for my perpetrator wasn't rich. Everything else is extremely similar. So what he did was he didn't allow me to have a voice. His voice was the only voice, and what mattered was what he wanted. And so he used emotional, psychological manipulation to make me do only what he wanted. To use the fact that I would want to have an intimate relationship with him, to have physical intimacy, to have physical warmth, to make him happy, to make him feel like he really, really loved me, as a tool to manipulate absolutely everything that happened within a physical, intimate relationship. So of course I said yes, of course I went along with it. Of course I, didn't think that I was being abused. But I was, because absolutely everything was about him controlling absolutely everything we did and me having no voice, none. And if I said that, or if I sort of said that I might not think that an idea was fun, or said that I didn't think certain things we'd want to do were really my cup of tea, then I was a prude, I was boring, I didn't care, I was not making an effort, all sorts of things would be said. Even down to, how long or short, an act of intimacy or sex would be, was controlled by him. If he wanted it to be long, it would be long. If he wanted it to be short, it would be short. Like I said, I had no voice. There was nothing about that sexual relationship which was about love and intimacy and closeness and balance. Nothing. It was completely out of balance. It's been one of the hardest things to recover from, actually, because it's not very well understood. The kind of experience that I experienced isn't well understood at all. And it's quite hard to get the right support for it. So all of these experiences happen to me. Sometimes when my friends say to me, "What kind of abuse did you experience?" I say, "Every kind," which is true. The other thing he did was invade your privacy, physical privacy. So he'd come in when you were in the bathroom. There was no lock on the bathroom door. He wouldn't let there be a lock. He'd come in when you were in the toilet. He would invade your privacy. And he would do that to everybody in the house. So he invaded your physical privacy as well as your privacy in your life by having the cameras everywhere. So you literally were not free. You're not a free person. And during lockdown, it was even worse. Literally was like living in a prison. I can't explain to you how bad that experience was. It was literally torturous. And I think that lockdown was torturous for many victims of domestic abuse.
This is a poem that I wrote about victim blaming. It's called Victims. Am I your victim? Am I she? The one who chose this? You think it's what I wanted to be? Do I have a weakness? Did I put up with it? Because I stayed, so I chose to get hit. Am I here because I was flawed? It's my flaws that made this shape. If only I had more boundaries and knew how to break the cycle and superhero cape. Am I always scared to you? My imperfections, all you see? Was it me that made it hard to leave? Was I down on bended knee? I'm not the victim that you conceive because it gets you off the hook. You try surviving a psychopath and live to write the book. A warrior is who you should see. Strength, you wouldn't know. Brave beyond all measures. So watch me, forever forward, go.
So since leaving, what I've also learned is there's this thing called post-separation abuse, where the perpetrator will try and still continue to manipulate anything they can through the process of, things like supervised contact or child contact, the court system, attempting to get your belongings back, attempting to return to your house, absolutely everything you can imagine. And there isn't enough protection in place for a person like myself or anybody else like us. There's a non-molestation order, which is rather simplistic, or a restraining order, but things like having the right to have your belongings returned to you don't have, having the right to return to your own property you don't have, having the right for your child to not have any further abuse experience happen to them after you've left. You don't have the right. You have to prove categorically that it's not safe before the authorities will put into place that your child doesn't have to have any more contact with this abusive person. 29 children have died during supervised contact in the context of domestic abuse. That's 29 children too many. It definitely needs to change. So there was a big fight after I left, through the courts, through the system. It was a big fight, and it was a long fight, and I had to be very determined, and I did make it to the other end. I remember my son's words to me not long before I left. Just as lockdown was starting to ease and you could meet people in the park, my son had already left our family home when he was 18. He just left and made himself homeless rather than live with his father a year before I left. And I met up with my son in the park, and he said to me, "Mum, you have to leave. And when you leave, you have to see it through to the bitter end, no matter what it takes." And that is what it takes. So my poem that I say about the warrior lioness, which is about you have to be a warrior on your own, warrior one, you do it on your own. There's no army, there is no collective, there is no It's true. I had a bit of legal support that was extremely expensive, tens of thousands of pounds. I had some support for short periods of time from domestic abuse services. I didn't quite meet their criteria a lot of times for much. And most of the support I received from the domestic abuse sector was giving me some emotional support and also helping me to understand what coercive control is and to understand what had happened to me. I did not receive any practical support at all from the domestic abuse sector, from social care or anybody else. I've received no support around how to manage, things like your security, your on devices or online abuse or stalking online. I've received no advice or support with regards to the financial abuse I suffered either. And the sector isn't equipped for that. It doesn't know how to deal with it. I think because I am a professional, because I speak well, I have a job, I'm well educated, I have some financial means, I was not considered in need of any support really. And in fact, a statistic that nobody wants you to know, but I'm going to tell you, and Mel B will tell you the same statistic. We do know this abuse happens to everyone we do. And we know it goes through every strata of society and every type of person can experience this abuse. It can happen to everyone. But we know that one group of women is much more likely to experience this abuse. They are 7 times more likely to experience this abuse. And nobody wants you to hear this, but I'm going to tell you. You are 7 times more likely to experience this abuse if you're a successful, well-educated woman with good financial means and independence. 7 times more likely. And that is why it happened to me, and that is why it happened to Mel B. Okay? It's a crime. And the person who wants to commit this crime has the most to gain if you have the most to give. And so I do believe that the whole of the system needs to gear itself up much better for women like me. It isn't really understanding the experience for successful, independent women like me. Mel B gets it, and she's campaigning a lot, and she says a lot of very helpful things and campaigns for a lot of helpful changes. But we really do need to wake up. We really do. I think it's uncomfortable for people to know that because that's an uncomfortable truth. It's a difficult truth, but it is the truth.
I've been a British Sign Language user now for about 30 years. I'm a speech and language therapist and I work in the deaf community. 2 of the passions of my life are poetry and British Sign Language. And what I like to do is combine the 2. This poem is called Glitter Ball. I shake the glass ball and watch glitter land like snowflakes on dreams, shining so beautifully here in my hand. I stare at the scene and wonder how it feels to have dreams to believe in and not to have hope that life steals. I want to touch it, hold it so close. I want to believe in happiness. Just give me one tiny dose. Instead, I stand here, sad, bruised, and afraid. Too long ago, all my dreams gone. Too many years, I stayed. Thank you.
So I just want to move on now to talking about what I think needs to change and what advice I would give other people. I agree with Mel B that the systemic change across the whole of society is what is needed. And I think we have to start with the authorities that are the most accountable for dealing with the situation. So it's simply not good enough that our police force isn't adequately trained in domestic abuse and the domestic abuse bill. That needs to change. It's simply not good enough that social care isn't trained effectively in the modern domestic abuse bill either, or that our mental health services are also consistently trained and updated. That would be a good place to start. And also what needs to change is what support looks like, and it needs to be much more informed by survivors' experiences. I do think that the services are trying to do that, but I think for people leading the way of the charitable sector, and it shouldn't be just the charitable sector, it should be the NHS, it should be, it should be social care actually asking those questions, and the court asking those questions about what needs to change, not just the charitable sector trying to change things. And they are trying to change things, but it's unfair to put too much weight on people like Women's Aid to be making all the changes on their own. So that's what I would say about the system, and until all of us in our society understands that we all have a role in getting this to change, it isn't going to change. So to each and every person living in our society, I would say, please see this as a crime. Don't see it as a social problem. Don't see it as marital breakdown. Don't see it as relationship breakdown. Don't see it as a bad relationship choice or a toxic relationship. It's a crime. Secondly, I would say, if someone you think that they're experiencing this, stay and be there for them. No matter what they say to you, no matter how distant they become, no matter how troubled they look, stay in touch with them and be a safe person for that person. If you can do that, you'll be able to help them. If you give up on them, if you say, oh well, she's not listening, oh well, I didn't say what she wants to hear, what can I do? And you turn your back, you can't help. That would be my message, is stay, be alongside that person however long it takes, and be a safe person for them to come to. You don't have to know everything, you don't have to know all the answers, just be there. For those of you experiencing this abuse, or surviving this abuse or coming out the other side, I would say you're strong. You're stronger than you know. If you're still standing and breathing, you have inner strength that you wouldn't believe, and you have to believe that about yourself. The second thing I'd say is try and reach out to other people, try and get support, try your own way to do that. If you keep trying to get support, if you reach out for support, it will make a difference. The next thing I'd say is don't give up. Too much is at stake. You have to keep going whatever it takes, and I know how hard it is to keep going and picking yourself up off the floor, but you have no choice. You just have to keep going. Keep going. I promise you, if you keep going, there is a really, really, really strong chance you'll make it like I did. The last thing I would say is try and look after yourself. Try and be kind to yourself. Do not blame yourself. Do not absorb that shame. Do not absorb other people's shame about this experience and this abuse that happened. It's not your blame. It's not your shame to carry. So please do not blame yourself. Do not be ashamed. None of this, absolutely none of this has happened because of anything to do with you. It's all to do with the person who's doing it. And please try to hold on to that. So what I'm hoping by sharing my experience, my advice, is that I can help other people, and that other people can learn, they can understand, they can help, or if they're in my shoes, they can feel less alone. I know it definitely helps me to know about people like Mel B, because it makes me feel less alone. And I just want to say to those of you out there, you're not alone, you're never alone.